Welcome back to the deep dive. The last two episodes we went through those initial hours of the Fukushima Daiichi accident. Really kind of getting a feel for that pressure those on-site operators were under.
Yeah, really intense
It
stuff.
was really intense, and now we're kind of taking this broader look, at the entire year following the accident, and we're going to use the IAEA's third technical report, TV3, as our guide.
That's right, and specifically focusing on what TV3 has to say about Japan's emergency preparedness and response, EPR for short.
EPR, so TV3 is massive. Where do we even begin with this deep dive?
Well, the report is structured chronologically, so that's helpful. It starts by diving into those first few chaotic days immediately after the earthquake and tsunami, March 11th to the 15th, 2011. So that's where we'll start too.
Okay, sounds good to me. In the last episode, we touched on those simultaneous challenges that the plant was facing: loss of all offsite power, damaged communication systems, and just the sheer scale of the event. What stood out to you about how the IAEA documented this period?
Well, it's really striking, the level of detail the report provides about the challenges faced by the emergency response organizations. Reading through it, you get a real sense of the confusion and the difficulty in coordinating that response, particularly between TEPCO, the plant operator, and the Japanese government.
It's really fascinating how these reports can kind of shed light on not just, the technical aspects of an event like this, but also that human element, those moments of decision-making under extreme pressure.
Absolutely. Take, for example, the Prime Minister's visit to the Fukushima Daiichi site on March 12th. It really highlights how high those stakes were and how much uncertainty everyone was grappling with.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly difficult to make, informed decisions with so much still unknown at that time. And speaking of tough calls, the report also delves into the debate surrounding seawater injection. That was a radical decision that ultimately helped prevent, a full-blown meltdown. What did you make of that discussion as documented in TV3?
Well, it's interesting what seems like a no-brainer now sacrificing the reactors to prevent a wider catastrophe. But that was a truly agonizing decision at the time. The report highlights the potential long-term consequences of using seawater, which would essentially destroy the reactors. But on the other hand, doing nothing could have led to an even more disastrous outcome.
Yeah, it really underscores that weight of responsibility, those in charge were carrying. You're making a decision that's not only going to impact, the immediate situation, but also have these lasting ramifications for the country and potentially even the world.
Exactly. And the report highlights how this decision was made under intense pressure, with limited information against the backdrop of an unfolding crisis. It's a reminder of the complexities of leadership during emergencies.
Absolutely. And TV3 goes on to detail how the site superintendent ultimately decided to proceed with seawater injection, believing that it was essential to prevent further damage. It's amazing to think about the courage it must have taken to make that call, knowing the consequences.
Absolutely. And, as we move forward in this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that context. These decisions weren't made in a vacuum. They were made by real people facing extraordinary circumstances.
Agreed. Now, kind of shifting gears a bit, TV3 spends a considerable amount of time discussing the evacuation and sheltering of residents. And we know from previous episodes that the Japanese government issued evacuation orders for those within a 20-kilometer radius of the plant. But what new insights does this report offer about that process?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was the report's acknowledgement of the challenges in implementing those evacuation orders. You have to remember that the infrastructure was crippled, communication was spotty, and, they were dealing with a situation of unprecedented scale. Getting people to safety was a Herculean effort.
And then there was all the confusion surrounding, sheltering instructions for those residents that were living between 10 and 20 kilometers away. It seems like that uncertainty added another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation.
It certainly did, and it highlights the importance of clear and consistent communication during emergencies. When people are scared and they're unsure of what to do, conflicting information can create panic and hinder the effectiveness of the response.
Absolutely. And speaking of, facing difficult conditions, TV3 goes on to detail the risks faced by the emergency workers at the Fukushima Daiichi site. What struck you about the report's coverage of this aspect?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was the report's focus on, the difficult working conditions and the very real dangers these individuals faced. Radiation exposure was a constant concern, requiring strict protective measures and monitoring. And with so many hospitals closed due to the disaster, access to medical care was limited.
And the report even mentions that they had to temporarily raise the dose limit for emergency workers to 250 millisieverts. And that's over 10 times the typical annual limit for a nuclear worker.
That's right. And it really underscores the level of risk these individuals were willing to take, to try and stabilize the situation. It's a testament to their bravery and their dedication.
And it wasn't just external radiation that they had to worry about. The report also highlights that issue of internal contamination among the emergency workers, particularly due to insufficient training in the use of respiratory protection.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It shows that even with the best intentions, there can be gaps in training and preparedness, especially when you're facing an event of this magnitude. And it highlights the need for comprehensive training programs, that cover a wide range of potential hazards.
It's a sobering reminder that even in a highly regulated industry like nuclear power, there's always room for improvement when it comes to worker safety.
Absolutely. Protecting those on the front lines of a disaster like this is paramount, and their willingness to put themselves at risk to mitigate the impact of this accident deserves recognition.
Agreed. Now let's shift our focus to another critical aspect of the response: controlling contamination in food and water. And this was a concern that stretched far beyond that immediate evacuation zone.
That's right. One of the things the report highlights is the initial lack of specific regulatory limits for radionuclides in food and drink. They were essentially building the plane as they were flying it.
So they're having to make these really critical decisions about food safety in real time based on evolving data and assessments. What a logistical nightmare that must have been.
It was. The report details the rapid implementation of restrictions on food and drinking water, the monitoring of various food products, and the ongoing challenges in determining those appropriate safety levels. They were dealing with everything from milk and leafy greens to rice and seafood.
Now remember, rice cultivation is a cornerstone of Japanese agriculture, and the report talks about the precautions they took with rice. Even mapping the radioactive cesium levels in agricultural soils.
It really was an all-encompassing effort to ensure public safety extending far beyond the immediate vicinity of the plant.
Absolutely. Now, as we've been discussing, the IAEA's TV3 report offers this really comprehensive look at that first year following the Fukushima Daiichi accident, covering everything from those on-site challenges to the widespread impacts on the surrounding environment and communities.
It's a fascinating document that provides valuable insights into, the complexities of managing a disaster like this.
But we've only just scratched the surface. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into the report, and we'll explore Japan's transition from that initial emergency response to that longer-term recovery phase.
So picking up where we left off, that transition from emergency response to long-term recovery is a critical point in the Fukushima story. And what really struck me in TV3 was that Japan, despite being a major nuclear power-producing nation, didn't have a well-defined plan for this phase before the accident happened.
Wow, that's a pretty shocking revelation, especially given, the scale and complexity of the challenges they were facing.
It is. The report actually states that Japan's existing framework hadn't fully considered the possibility of long-term recovery operations needing to cover such a vast area.
So they were essentially making it up as they went along. That seems incredibly risky.
In a sense, yeah. The report doesn't shy away from acknowledging that Japan had to create new organizations and initiatives on the fly to tackle those long-term challenges of decontamination, waste management, and community recovery. It was a massive undertaking.
It really makes you appreciate the sheer scope of this disaster and its long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. And it highlights the need for comprehensive long-term recovery planning, even for events that seem unimaginable. It's about anticipating the unthinkable and having the flexibility to adapt to evolving circumstances.
Speaking of adapting, let's kind of delve into another fascinating aspect of TV3, the report's analysis of Japan's approach to nuclear safety regulations before the accident.
Right. The report delves into the historical evolution of those regulations, showing how they'd already been evolving in response to previous events, like the JCO criticality accident back in 1999. And that event prompted significant restructuring and changes in licensing procedures for nuclear power plants.
So, in a way, they were already on the path towards stricter safety measures before Fukushima, but the accident just exposed how much further they needed to go.
Exactly. It served as a stark reminder that even a country with a relatively mature nuclear program can have vulnerabilities.
And what's particularly interesting is how the report highlights this specific difference between Japan's approach to assessing certain hazards and international practices at the time.
Yeah, this is where the concept of historical records comes in. In the 1960s and 70s, the international trend was to use these records to predict the likelihood of extreme events. But Japan took a slightly different path.
So instead of just relying on what had happened in the past, they added a safety margin to account for the possibility of events exceeding those historical records.
Exactly. It was a way of acknowledging that you can't predict everything Mother Nature might throw at you. The report even uses the Onagawa nuclear power plant as an example.
Ah, Onagawa, the plant that was hit by the same tsunami as Fukushima, but survived with minimal damage. It's a fascinating case study.
It is, and TV3 really digs into the factors that contributed to its resilience. One key difference was that Onagawa's main plant grade level was higher than Fukushima's, providing a greater buffer against that tsunami's impact. But it wasn't just about elevation. Onagawa also benefited from its location in a ria, a coastal inlet with a V shape.
So the shape of the coastline actually helped to dissipate that wave energy.
Precisely. It's a reminder that location and design can play a significant role in a plant's ability to withstand extreme events.
It sounds like a classic example of how multiple layers of protection can make all the difference. And speaking of layers of protection, TV3 goes deep on the concept of defense in depth, a fundamental safety principle in the nuclear industry.
It does, and it's a crucial concept to understand because it underpins so much of how nuclear plants are designed and operated. Essentially, it's all about having multiple layers of protection to prevent accidents and mitigate their consequences. It's like a safety net on top of a safety net.
But, as the Fukushima accident tragically demonstrated, even those multiple layers of defense can be overwhelmed by events that exceed expectations.
That's right. And the report stresses the importance of designing for beyond design basis scenarios. It's about anticipating those what-if situations that go beyond normal operating conditions and preparing for the unthinkable.
Because sometimes the unimaginable does happen. And it seems like the report doesn't pull any punches when it comes to critiquing the emergency procedures that were in place at Fukushima Daiichi.
It doesn't. For instance, it specifically calls out the lack of detailed analysis for what's known as a station blackout, or SBO, affecting multiple units simultaneously.
So for those of us who aren't nuclear engineers, can you break down what an SBO is and why it was so critical in this case?
Of course, an SBO is essentially when you lose all off-site power to the plant. The reactors shut down automatically, but that nuclear fuel continues to generate heat, what we call decay heat, that needs to be removed to prevent damage.
And in the case of Fukushima, that tsunami not only knocked out the off-site power grid, but also took out the backup generators that were supposed to kick in during such an event.
Exactly. And it turned out that while they were prepared for a single-unit SBO, they weren't ready for a multi-unit extended loss of power like what they experienced. That was a critical vulnerability exposed by the accident.
So having a plan for a single reactor losing power wasn't enough. A total blackout across multiple units seems like a scenario they hadn't fully anticipated.
And that's precisely the point. TV3 emphasizes the need for procedures and guidelines that cover a broader spectrum of potential events, including those considered highly unlikely, right? You know, it's about expanding the scope of what's considered possible and planning for those scenarios, no matter how remote they may seem.
Essentially, planning for the unthinkable, even if it's extremely unlikely to occur.
Exactly, and the report goes even further, critiquing the existing emergency operating procedures, or EOPs that were in place. It seems those procedures were very focused on specific scenarios, which limited their flexibility in a rapidly evolving situation like Fukushima.
That makes sense. If you're facing a situation you've never encountered before, trying to force it into a predefined box might not be the most effective approach.
Right. It's like trying to use a map of Paris to navigate the streets of Tokyo. It just doesn't work. Instead, the IAEA recommends something called symptom-based procedures for those beyond design basis events.
Symptom-based? That sounds intriguing.
It is. Think of it this way. Instead of a rigid checklist for every specific scenario, which is impossible to create for every imaginable situation, you focus on responding to the symptoms you're seeing. If you observe X, Y, and Z happening, you take action A, regardless of the specific cause. It's about flexibility and quick thinking when facing the unknown.
So it's more about adaptability and responding to the situation at hand rather than trying to fit it into a predetermined category.
Precisely, and that leads us to another important recommendation in TV3, establishing clear interfaces between the different levels of emergency response.
So you're talking about ensuring smooth communication and coordination between the on-site emergency response organization, the off-site centers, and the national government, right?
Exactly. Everyone needs to be on the same page and able to share information quickly and efficiently, and that's something that was a challenge at Fukushima.
We saw glimpses of that in the previous episodes, those communication breakdowns, the sheer volume of information being exchanged. It must have been incredibly difficult to get a clear picture of what was happening and make informed decisions.
It was, and the report highlights how that lack of clarity can hinder the effectiveness of the response. It also underscores the importance of having specific policies, guidelines, and criteria for transitioning from that emergency phase to the long-term recovery phase. Because that transition isn't like flipping a switch, It's a complex process that needs to be carefully managed.
And it seems like Japan was figuring that out in real time as the crisis was unfolding.
The report acknowledges that they essentially had to write the playbook as they went along, which highlights the need for more comprehensive planning even for those later stages of a disaster response.
It's like running a marathon and realizing halfway through that you don't have a plan for what to do once you cross the finish line.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial element of the response, the role of the IAEA.
Right. We touched on that earlier when we discussed the international cooperation aspect. What new insights does TB3 offer about the IAEA's involvement?
Well, the report details the IAEA's efforts in coordinating international assistance, disseminating information about the accident, and facilitating the sharing of lessons learned. They really acted as the central hub for the global response.
They were essentially the central nervous system of the international effort, connecting different parts of the world and ensuring everyone had access to the latest information. But, as you've alluded to, even the IAEA faced challenges.
They did. Interestingly, the report mentions that the Convention on Assistance in the case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency, a key international agreement, wasn't invoked. And the IAEA's Response and Assistance Network, or RANET, wasn't utilized either.
That seems strange. Why wouldn't they use those existing mechanisms?
Well, it appears Japan opted to receive assistance directly from individual countries rather than going through the IAEA's formal channels. The report suggests that this might have been due to a lack of national arrangements for accepting international aid. It's almost like they weren't prepared for the sheer scale of the international response.
So even accepting help can be a complex process in the midst of such an event.
It can, but despite those challenges, the IAEA still played a vital role in coordinating support and providing technical expertise. They also worked closely with other international organizations like the World Health Organization and the World Meteorological Organization to ensure a coordinated response.
It sounds like the accident really put international cooperation to the test, revealing both the strength and weaknesses of the existing systems.
It did, and one of the key outcomes of the IAEA's response was the Ministerial Conference on Nuclear Safety held in June 2011.
We mentioned that earlier, but it's worth revisiting, given its significance.
Absolutely. This conference was a direct response to the Fukushima accident, bringing together representatives from over 100 countries to discuss ways to enhance global nuclear safety.
So it was about taking the lessons learned from this tragedy and using them to make the entire nuclear industry safer.
Exactly. The conference resulted in a declaration that recognized the need for improvements in various areas, including emergency preparedness and response, regulatory independence, and, of course, international cooperation.
It was a catalyst for change on a global scale, driven by the shared realization that an accident like Fukushima could happen anywhere.
It was, and that brings us to the end of this part of our deep dive into the IAEA's TV3 report. We've covered a lot of ground, from the challenges of transitioning to long-term recovery to the need for robust regulations and international cooperation. But there's still more to explore.
And when we return, we'll dive into the final chapter of TV3, which focuses on the key lessons learned from the Fukushima Daiichi accident. What insights did the IAEA glean from this experience, and what recommendations did they make to prevent a similar disaster from happening again? So we spent the last two episodes, really digging into the IAEA's in-depth report on the Fukushima Daiichi accident, specifically their third technical report, TV3. We've seen the immediate response, the challenges of, transitioning to long-term recovery, and the critical role of international cooperation. Now, I'm really curious to hear what the IAEA identified as those key lessons learned. What insights did they pull from this experience, and what recommendations did they make to prevent another Fukushima from happening?
Well, that's a great question, and it's exactly what TV3's final chapter focuses on. One of the most striking takeaways is this need to continuously reassess site-related hazards throughout a plant's entire lifespan.
That seems obvious in hindsight, but I guess it's easy to assume that once a plant is built and deemed safe, it stays that way. But Fukushima clearly demonstrates that's not the case.
Right. The Fukushima Daiichi plant wasn't new. It had been operating for decades. And while that tsunami risk might not have been fully understood back when it was built, the science has evolved since then.
So what might have been considered a safe location decades ago could be deemed unacceptable by today's standards.
Exactly. That's why the report really hammers home the need for that ongoing hazard evaluation. It's not enough to just do it once and assume you're good to go. You need to be constantly reevaluating and adapting to new knowledge, updated methods, and changes in regulations. It's about being proactive and identifying potential vulnerabilities before they turn into disasters.
So it's a continuous process of learning and improvement, even for plants that have been operating safely for years.
Precisely. And the report even highlights that role that national and international peer reviews can play in this process. Getting fresh perspectives from outside experts can help ensure you're not overlooking potential risks. It's about having those checks and balances in place.
It makes you wonder how many other plants around the world might have vulnerabilities that weren't fully considered during their initial design, simply because the understanding of certain hazards has evolved over time.
It's a thought-provoking question, and one that the IAEA clearly wants us to consider. Another major lesson the report focuses on is this importance of having a strong and truly independent regulatory body.
That makes sense. You need an organization that can objectively assess risks and hold plant operators accountable without being influenced by political or economic pressures.
Exactly, and TV3 is pretty critical of the regulatory structure that existed in Japan before the accident. It suggests that the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, or NISA as it was known, wasn't sufficiently independent from the government and industry stakeholders.
So there might have been pressure to prioritize other factors, perhaps economic considerations over safety concerns.
That's certainly a possibility that the report raises, and it highlights how that lack of independence can create blind spots when it comes to safety. The report even suggests that NISA wasn't always fully respected by TEPCO, the plant operator, as a strong regulatory authority.
Wow, that's a pretty significant finding. It makes you wonder if there were warning signs that might have been ignored or downplayed because of this power dynamic.
It's definitely something to consider, and the report doesn't stop there. It also critiques the overall safety culture within Japan's nuclear industry, arguing that there was this reluctance to challenge established assumptions and practices.
It's like that saying, the biggest risk is not knowing you're taking one.
Exactly. The report stresses the need for a culture of continuous questioning, where people feel empowered to speak up about potential safety issues, no matter their position or their rank. It's about fostering, a healthy skepticism and a willingness to learn from mistakes, even small ones.
So it's not just about having the right rules and regulations. It's about creating an environment where safety is truly everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's a lesson that goes far beyond the nuclear industry. It applies to any organization where safety is paramount.
It's a reminder that even the most well-established and respected organizations can fall prey to complacency and groupthink if they're not careful.
Precisely. And the report makes it clear that those lessons are just as relevant today as they were back in 2011. Fukushima was a wake-up call not just for Japan, but for the entire world.
And on that note, we come to the end of our three-part deep dive into the IAEA's report on the Fukushima Daiichi accident. We've explored the events, the challenges and the responses, as well as those crucial lessons learned. It's been a journey that's both sobering and thought-provoking.
It has. And as we conclude this deep dive, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic. Reflect on the insights that resonated most with you and consider how they apply, not just to nuclear energy, but to any field where safety and risk management are paramount. After all, understanding the past is crucial to preventing similar tragedies in the future.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.